I heard a really great piece of advice recently, which is if you are not in a workplace where you can implement a project that you need to do to show off your skills, implement the project anyway. Come up with a dream project. Come up with something that you want to analyze out there in the world. Use open source data and do that project, and then publicize it. Talk about it on social media, on LinkedIn, and so forth. And that's experience.
All right. Today, I am talking to Huw Hallam, Senior Data and Insights Analyst at a lesser-known university called the University of Oxford. Today, Huw and I are going to be talking about how fundraisers and nonprofit professionals can take advantage of data-driven and AI-driven technologies within their work, specifically within the context of higher education fundraising. Huw, thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure, Jack. Thank you for having me.
So I want to start off with maybe what I've started every conversation off with for the past year and a half. What changes to your work or to development in general have you seen during the COVID-19 pandemic?
There have been so many. Firstly, everything's kind of gone digital. The events and so forth that we would normally run to engage people in stewardship, they've all had to go into digital platforms. So that's been massive. Giving has mostly been digital. The amount that transactions have gone through our website rather than through other forms has changed hugely. And the value of gifts coming through our website has also changed. The way people give has changed too, I think due to all sorts of economic factors. People's expendable income has changed dramatically. Some people have more than they would usually have if they have been, say, working from home and not had certain things to spend money on that they would normally spend money on. Yeah. For some people, it's been very different. They've been out of work. Their income's been much less. So people's capacity to give has changed a huge amount. And I think also people's desire to give has also changed. Some people through the pandemic have really felt a need to give when they haven't had that need. They haven't felt that need in the same way before. Maybe it's because they've seen friends or family, loved ones suffering in different ways through the pandemic, or because they've reconnected with nature, for example, in a different way. So there's been a lot of changes to why people are giving and the motivation as well. Some of that stuff I know through reading, through other research that's been done. It's often quite hard to see that in your own data, unfortunately. But so loads of changes like that. My whole office has been working from home for over a year now, so there's been a lot of internal changes to how we do things as well.
Do you think things are going to go back to the way they were before? Do you think in-person events are going to have a bit of a surge in the next coming months?
I think they will, but I think that a lot of institutions are going to hold on to doing things digitally as well. I mean, one of the really beautiful things that happened was that we realized that we were able to reach people who were all around the world and who would not normally be able to come to our events. And I mean, even just in my private life, I had friends who were in one country suddenly doing exercise classes with friends who were in another country online because they could. And that was as sensible as doing it with the person next door suddenly. So I think there's room for a lot of inclusivity that we didn't really see before. And so I think that a lot of institutions are going to want to hold on to that, but I think there will also be a real joy in going back to doing things in person as well.
And how has the pandemic impacted your work specifically as a senior data and insights analyst? Is there, this might be a simplistic way to look at your role, but is there more data to analyze? Now that everything is online, must be more interactions you can track. And
in some ways it hasn't affected what I do all that much. You're right, there are more online interactions, but the scope of those interactions hasn't changed all that much. So while there's more data that's passing through my workflows, It hasn't necessarily changed the kinds of things that I'm asking about with those data flows.
What are the investments and internal alignments necessary to implement AI or other machine learning into a fundraising department?
Yeah, good question. There are lots of things. We in my office in Oxford, we haven't actually incorporated AI yet into what we're doing. We're looking at it. We're trying to understand how that's going to take place. And it's really challenging. I think there needs to be a lot of understanding of what it can do that's spread through all of the senior management. That's kind of almost step number one. And because it's still not being used all that much within the philanthropic sector, it's still, relatively new. Each year it's been used more and more. Often there's a bit of work that needs to be done to help senior management to understand how it could be used and why it would be beneficial and what differences it would make. So there's a whole lot of work there. Then there's a whole lot of work around actually getting in the skills and the technology to be able to do things. You have to kind of assess what might be appropriate for your institution. We're quite large scale in terms of what we do with fundraising. For a small or medium scale institution, they may not have the volume of internal data to do sort of big data AI style analytics. They can still work with enriched data, and there are other ways to incorporate AI into what they do, but it wouldn't make sense necessarily for them to sort of grow a substantial analytics team with their own AI skills for implementation. For our scale of fundraising, I think it does make sense to grow a team like that, but that requires a lot of buy-in because that's quite a bit of human resource required. So there's that side, there's the training. Like I said before, it's not, AI skills in our sector are not so common. So it's quite difficult to get people into a team who already have those skills, which means you kind of have to get a team that's trainable and then find ways to train them as well. So that's a little challenge. Then there's a whole lot around data governance and compliance, all of that. AI sounds scary to some people.
Yeah, definitely.
It doesn't have to be scary at all. It can actually be quite discreet in what it does, but it can sound scary. And it's really important that you're able to explain the uses of it to the people you're working with, but also your other stakeholders, your donors, that they understand why you're using AI and how you're using AI as well. So there are a whole lot of questions around that also need to be worked through. So there's a lot. There's getting the executive buy-in, there's getting the human resources and skills, there's getting technological requirements for it as well. And then there's working out how you actually want to do it and finding out how to make sure that's encoded in sort of privacy notices and all of your compliance documentation and so forth.
And what would you use AI for if you could get it implemented tomorrow? What do you think is a cool use case?
So my particular team, I work in sort of mass fundraising and regular giving and that kind of thing. My use case that I want the most is to do with donor personas, understanding different styles of giving, different kinds of, long-term giving patterns as well. So that's what I want to use AI for looking into those patterns and being able to get a much better grip on what style of donors people are, so I can then know how to approach them better and sort of go, okay, you look from this patterning like somebody who is going to give over the course of maybe several decades. And it might be that it starts at a fairly low level of giving and it gradually amplifies. But I would love to be able to see that and then to be able to craft the relationship with that person in a suitable way.
Yeah, and especially with, with regular giving on a large scale, you would need AI to be able to read all of these variables. You can't possibly, be able to look at all those variables and predict, well, this person's going to give for decades to come. But if you have a piece of software implemented that can read all those variables, that would be massively useful, I would imagine.
Yeah, exactly. And if you've got several 100,000 alumni, which is what we have as well, even if you were humanly able to look at the kind of giving pattern and other metrics that you had on an individual basis, there's no way you could go through a whole database of 300,000 people and actually do that. So that's my personal thing that I would be using AI for, that I'm most excited about. And I do think it offers capacity to do that in a way that less advanced forms of analytics just don't.
Switching gears a little bit, not every nonprofit has a base of 300,000 donors or alumni that they can draw from. So what is a way that small to mid-sized nonprofits can take advantage of data analysis technologies? What's a way that maybe they could get started with analyzing the data that they do have?
Sure. Well, there are different ways to get the data enriched for a start. I think...
What does enriched mean?
Yeah, good question. I think conventionally, that would mean by going through wealth engines that would look at giving capacity and that kind of thing. But I think now there are ways to enrich it with data around behavior drawn from web activity and so forth that can give you much more of a sense of what people are actually interested in, which can then help you change the pitch for different groups of people. Again, it's going to depend on your institution, but if you're at a university, as I am, there are a whole lot of different kinds of activities that you can promote. We could promote something from medical sciences. We could promote something from the humanities. These things are going to appeal to quite different people. Sometimes that appeal is going to be directly in line with what they studied, which is what you'd expect and what we will often use as a metric. But if you have more behavioral data, you can actually see that, no, these people are really interested in geology, even though they studied humanities or something else. And then you can change the way you approach them as a fundraiser. So I think it's possible for much smaller institutions to be able to engage with that kind of data. There are companies out there that are allowing for that data enrichment so that they can navigate that behavioral information. So I think that's one way. I think there is also a lot that you can do on a fairly small scale with more traditional analytics techniques as well. There's a lot that you can do with Excel or if you want to go down that route, you can use open source software like Python and Pandas and so forth to do a great deal of analysis of the data that you've got. You can look at the different giving histories and try to understand the patternings in them. You can look at how current appeals are working. There's a lot of statistical work you can do on, checking whether one appeal is doing well relative to another and doing that evaluative work to actually see if it's a successful appeal or if you need to change track or if it's successful with certain segments but not other segments. So I think there is loads that a smaller scale institution can do.
Yeah, and I think you've touched on this a few times, but it's the notion of segmentation, finding those. You've mentioned donor personalities, you mentioned segments, trying to find those, exactly like you said, people who are interested in geology, even if they studied the humanities.
Yeah.
Trying to find different ways to separate your donors. There's a lot of different ways to do that. And I think in a lot of CRMs, you can even do that to get started.
Yeah, exactly. We're using Blackboard's enterprise CRM, and it's we've heavily customized it, but I've noticed that their Razor's Edge product already has some discrete AIs built into it. I know that Salesforce is doing something similar as well. So you may actually already have, as a smaller institution, be using AIs in certain ways without knowing it.
Exactly. So as not things like AI, as AI and data analysis technologies frees fundraising staff and administrative staff from combing over data or doing different administrative tasks, what should they focus their time on?
Doing what they do best better, basically. Being more creative in the way they pitch their fundraising messages, being more hands-on with their stewardship, expanding their prospect pool because they've got time for it. I mean, I don't know any fundraisers who have nothing to do, as it were. Everybody has a broader prospect pool than they can actually fully deal with. And they sort of look at this prospect pool and know that if they have more time, they could go deeper into it and engage with more people. So I think it's just going to free up so much time for fundraisers to be able to engage more directly with more people. So even though it sounds like on the surface AI means that you're kind of, getting a bot to do the work that fundraisers would normally do, as it were, and that you are in some ways distancing the fundraiser from the prospect. I think what it will allow is actually the opposite, more communication, more direct communication.
I really like that. I hadn't considered prospect research or just prospecting as something that you can invest more time into. I don't know why I didn't think about that, but yeah, I think especially for higher level education, there's always more people that you can reach out to. And I think stewardship as well is something that really warrants more time than you think it does, especially for those lower level donors who may have been neglected in the past.
Definitely. I mean, we know that we have a real problem with this, that we're not doing stewardship as well as we would like to. And we just don't have that capacity, the resource, which is terrible. We don't want it to be that way at all.
Yeah, I like to think of AI as a job enhancement tool rather than a job replacement tool. It's not going to replace bad fundraising practices, and it's not necessarily going to make fundraising practices better. It's just going to give you a little bit more time to do them.
Yeah, I completely agree. And it's not going to get rid of data work either, because chances are actually you'll need a data team to be able to monitor it and make sure that it's working properly. So I don't really see it as a job replacement tool, at least not in our sector.
Yeah. What are some best practices for data cleaning or data modeling? I know those are quite different. Let's start with data cleaning. What are some best practices for data cleaning that you would give to any fundraiser?
Oh, goodness. This is one of the questions that I'm kind of slightly tempted to say, let's just skip this one. I mean, do it, document it, create repeatable processes so that you don't have to keep doing it kind of manually each time and working through the same steps. Yeah, create an algorithm for it, but document it so that you know what's actually going on. That's probably what I'd say.
Yeah, I think maybe just work it into your schedule, make it something that's a part of the, when you're working around the house, you don't want to just clean everything up on Sunday. You want to do a little bit here, put put your socks in the hamper, clean the dishes when they're done, something like that, baking it into routine. And as for modeling, what are some modeling practices that you use in your work?
So when you're talking about modeling, are you talking about creating data definitions and that level of modeling, or are you talking more about creating machine learning models?
The former.
The former. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm sort of involved in modeling. We're doing a big modeling project at the moment at Oxford, trying to just go through all of the data in the CRM. But I'm slightly peripheral to that. I sort of get brought in occasionally. It takes longer than you'll expect. I think that's one of the first things I would say, like be prepared for a lot of work and a lot of challenges with it. It is valuable work, but it's hugely time consuming. We've been working on our modeling project for almost a year now, and there's still quite a lot to do.
What was the time you were impressed by the insights or the predictions that not necessarily AI, but data-driven insights have given you, that you took a step back and you say, wow, that's really cool that we're able to understand that?
Yeah, good question. So I have a little workflow that I've created that predicts amounts that will come back from the campaigns that we do. And they need to be reworked. So I'm a little bit, I don't love them because I know that we could rework them and finesse them in many ways. But they frequently hit pretty close to the target. So one of my colleagues loves them. She's just like, oh my gosh, it keeps working. And I sort of think, well, how is it working? I feel like it must be chance that it's working, because I feel like we need to improve these statistics a lot. But it's just great to be able to roll out a prediction at the start of a campaign and sort of go, okay, this is our ballpark figure of what we think this might bring in. And sometimes it makes us really revise how we approach the campaign, because we look at it and just think, wait a second, this is so much lower than some of our other campaigns. Why are we doing this campaign at all? And like I said, it doesn't always come out correct, and there's scope to revise it. But even something quite rough is incredibly helpful for thinking through what the campaigns are we do. And then changing our approach as well.
And what sort of variables are you studying to predict the success of a campaign?
For those, we are looking at philanthropic histories. We're looking at certain demographic elements. We're looking at aspects of behavior as well. And we're sort of bringing those three things together.
Well, that's cool. You can get such a high level of prediction for something that you think can be improved.
Yeah. Yeah, it's good. And I mean, it can be improved. I know that it can be improved because the predictions were drawn from a relatively limited data set that was quite biased in some respects. It was from a big campaign that we did a couple of years ago that was purely focused on humanities alumni. So we know that there are kind of variations that happen when we start engaging with alumni from other areas of the university.
Yeah.
But even still, it already does enough to help us with our appeal planning.
Yeah, well, you got to be careful because they might just boot you out if they feel confident enough in it. You gotta keep telling them, "Whoa, we got some work to do still. It could be even better." I want to talk ethics for a little bit. What do you think is an ethical consideration that you have to keep in mind for data-driven technologies in order to use them responsibly?
Sure. Well, especially with AI, bias is always a problem because it draws on existing patterns. So if you have a situation where structural bias exists in the world, and AI is going to pick up on that structural bias, and it's likely going to amplify it. And sometimes that bias comes in a really masked way. So it might be that you don't have, say, gender as a variable, and this is a pretty well-known problem, but you might have, say, salary. We don't actually have salary. We're not using that in our algorithms at the moment, but as an example. And it's known that there is a correlation between salary and gender due to structural bias. So if you start using that, and this has been a problem with HR algorithms, it can start to then pick up patterns that relate to gender. So you have to always be careful that some of these kind of demographic variables are not encoded in other variables as well. How that plays out in fundraising is a little bit complex. It really depends on what you're using the algorithm for. We in this sector are not making decisions about things that are going to affect people's lives, as it were, like whether they can get a particular kind of loan or something like that. So those issues, which are built into a lot of data protection legislation, aren't so much of a problem for us. But we have to make sure that the way we're approaching people, the way we ask them, meets our own standards, our own sense of integrity about how we should operate as fundraisers. And so it's really important that we monitor AIs and make sure that they aren't guiding us down certain paths that are biased in different ways, and that we're making sure that we're asking people in a way that we would want to ask them if we weren't using the AI, if I can put it in those terms.
Yeah, and that's tricky as well, because if you are qualifying prospects for a campaign based on salary, you would imagine that's the most important factor. I mean, well, perhaps not the most important indicator that someone's going to give, but I would, if I'm a fundraiser, I want to know how much someone makes. It's going to give a clear indication of their capacity to give. So how do you balance that between being gender exclusive and acting on an actionable data point.
Yeah, exactly. How do we do that? It's really important, and to make sure it's also, that we're approaching people the right way in terms of race as well as gender, and making sure that these kind of data points that are picking up things that are generally influenced by forms of social exclusion, structural racism, etc., that they aren't. Sorry, I've just got a call coming in that I'm getting rid of.
No problem.
Yeah, that they aren't affecting our choices and our behavior.
Yeah, and I imagine, and you may not be able to respond in detail to this question, but imagine as an extension of a highly prestigious university, there's certain biases that are baked, for better or for worse, baked into the way that the university does its work. I mean, Oxford, Harvard, Cambridge, these places are built on reputation, and they're built on perpetuating a standard that you would try to, I guess, exploit through fundraising, but you also have to manage responsibly.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, just a very simple bit on that. A number of the colleges associated with Oxford were single gender for up until decades ago. Some of them. So the actual alumni body is highly skewed in terms of gender. Yeah. So these things have to be kind of looked at and taken into consideration in some way.
Absolutely. What's a fundraising metric that you think fundraisers should monitor that may not currently receive enough attention?
Behavior. I'm going to say anything.
Behavior. Well, you got to be more specific. You got to be more specific than that.
I need to be more specific than
that's
behavior.
All fundraisers measure is behavior.
When we look at behavior, we look at whatever we can find in our database for a start, because that's our primary source of data. So it's what kind of emails are people getting from us that they're responding to? What are the events that they're going to? We do a lot of quant work. We look at how many of things they've got. It's harder for us to start to break things down into quality. What style of email are people actually getting and opening, and how do we bring that qualitative distinction into what we're doing? But I think that's hugely important to improve the way that we speak with people. So that's kind of what I mean when I say behavior. I think a lot of traditional analytics in the sector are looking at how often people are donating, when did they last donate, this kind of time-based behavior. But I want to know what people are interested in and how we find ways to engage with them in ways they want to be engaged with, in ways that are more donor-centric.
Yeah, and Kit, my company right now, is actually working on a communication style insight. So we have, I think, a fairly high confidence interval that allows you to input someone's communication style. And then through that, you can segment your donors based on communication style and send, appeals that can be modeled to their preferences. So I think stuff like that's pretty cool. And the segmentations that you mentioned, again, can be done through a CRM or something like MailChimp, that you can see what's the open rate for this subject line. Well, what if I use their name in the subject line? What if I use my name in the sender? And I think what you said, seeing behavior, but then also experimenting is, I think, even a more important factor, trying to find out what works for your organization and your donors, different segments of your donors.
Yeah, exactly. A/B test as much as you can.
Yes. Yeah. What are some of your favorite data analysis or AI-driven technologies that you use in your work?
Okay, so I have to mention Alteryx here. It was like my gateway piece of software, as it were, when I first started doing this kind of work. And it got me from working with Excel spreadsheets into the land of doing much more advanced analytics and having repeatable workflows. So I found it really easy to engage with, and they have a really great support community for learning. So I have to name drop it. It's been wonderful. I'm slowly moving away from it now. I'm doing much more work in pandas and using open source software. And that kind of stuff is hugely important if you have a stretched budget, as so many in the non-profit sector are going to have.
Yeah.
And there's loads of online learning material that's free or quite accessible in terms of price for that kind of stuff. It's more challenging than using sort of drag and drop software like Alteryx, but the fact that it's open source and anybody can actually access it is incredible. So all of those things I have to mention, they're kind of my favorites at the moment.
Yeah, well, if that's going to be your gateway drug of choice, then I would recommend that to everybody. It's a safer way to experience the world. My last and maybe most important question for you: how does someone who does a Doctor of Philosophy music research get into data analysis a little bit later in life?
Yeah, good question. It sort of happened by chance in some ways. I ended up in a role in fundraising, not entirely knowing what I was getting myself in for. And I was in that role for sort of a good 12 months, just kind of finding my feet and doing as many things as possible. There was a gap where our regular giving team had kind of just collapsed. So I ended up for a period being the only member of the regular giving team, but having fairly minimal experience at that point, and being used to just trying to join lots of dots from, I guess, in some ways, my PhD experience. And trying to find ways to make things work. I got some really great mentoring during that year as well, from one of the senior members of our team who I worked closely with. And at the end of the year, we got to a point where we were ready to build out the team. And so the roles then started splitting and becoming much more specialist. And a job was created, which was in data analytics, which is the job that I subsequently applied for and got. And I'd been enjoying the analytics side of my work. I'd always been strong at maths in high school, but that was by now quite some time ago. But I just worked hard and I picked up the skills I needed and I adapted and I slowly have grown into the role. And continue to grow into the role. It's an interesting role to be doing. It can be intimidating, I think, for people who want to go down that area. They can look at different MA courses and just think, how do I get into this? This is too hard, or I have to commit too much in terms of learning. I've been really lucky because I've been able to do on-the-job learning and I've been able to actually try things out and implement them based on my learning. So I recognize that I've been very fortunate there. But I kind of just want to say to anybody who's sort of looking at their options and going, well, I know I like this kind of thing, but I feel like I don't have the right training. You can get that training. You can do lots of online courses. I'm doing work at the moment through ODSC, which is great. I've done courses through Coursera as well, some great courses through Stanford and Imperial there. So training is accessible. I heard a really great piece of advice recently, which is if you are not in a workplace where you can implement a project that you need to do to show off your skills, implement the project anyway. Come up with a dream project. Come up with something that you want to analyze out there in the world. Use open source data and do that project and then publicize it. Talk about it on social media, on LinkedIn and so forth. And that's experience.
Yeah.
So definitely, I mean, I would say also in our sector, because there is so little experience in using and implementing AI, that the reality of somebody being hired who has an MA in that area is probably fairly low. So this is a really good area to be working in if you want to develop those skills, but don't have that kind of formal level of training.
Yeah, and I think that is a common story in the fundraising world. I think a lot of people stumble into it and find that they're quite good at it and they forge their own lane, just like you. Huw, thank you so much for joining me today. This was awesome. I loved hearing your perspective, and I think others will as well.
Thanks, Jack. It's been a pleasure.